Acts 13, what we read there, Acts 13, it tells of a meeting in I don't know if they had more than one in those towns or not, but this was in a Jewish religious gathering, a meeting place, their synagogue, in Pisidia, Antioch of Pisidia, which is different from Antioch of Syria. And when offered the opportunity to speak to those in the synagogue, notice how Paul addressed them in the first verse that we read there, Acts 13:16. Then Paul stood up and beckoning with his hand said, Men of Israel, and you that fear God, give audience. In other words, listen up. Paul addressed the two types of people in the synagogue. And then when you come down to verse 26, he's more defining. He tells a little more about it. Men and brethren, those are two groups, but he gives them a different name there. Children of the stock of Abraham, that's the brethren. And whosoever among you feareth God, to you is the word of this salvation sent. And again in Acts 13:26, Paul addresses the two types of people in the synagogue as men and brethren. But then Paul goes on further to define them as children of the stock of Abraham, and whosoever among you feareth God. The children of the stock of Abraham would be the brethren at the beginning of the verse. And whosoever among you feareth God, in verse 26, would be the ye that fear God, in verse 16 that we read first. So in the synagogue, besides the Jews, there were Gentiles, often called Greeks. And we're not talking about the temple. Gentiles and Greeks were not allowed in the temple. But in the synagogues they were. They were called Greeks because they feared the God of Abraham and blessed Israel in some way, either with offerings or food or one person, trying to think of the word, centurion, built the Jews a synagogue. He was not a Jew, but he sided with them. He believed God was working through Israel. Why would fearing God make the Greeks different from the rest of the Gentiles? The rest of the Gentiles were aliens. They were separated from Israel. Well, that relates back to Genesis 12 and the covenant God had made with Abram, who was later called Abraham. Let's look at that covenant in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Now the Lord had said to Abram, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And here we go. And I will bless them that bless thee. So if someone wanted a blessing from God, here God's telling how to get it. Bless Israel. I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Well, that has yet to come, doesn't it? In that covenant, you can see that God gave special blessings, special status to Abraham, and to those who descended from him, later narrowed down to those descending through Isaac and Jacob, renamed Israel. But when you read Genesis 12, verse 3 carefully, you see that besides blessing Israel, God also promised to bless some Gentiles who fit into that qualification in the verse. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. Often the King James Bible calls those Gentiles who bless Israel Greeks, partly because of the knowledge-seeking Greek culture that had been in place there a couple hundred years already. So, in the Jewish synagogue in Antioch of Pisidia, after preaching the gospel of God, and that's a specific gospel that God named and titled it the gospel of God in His Word, after preaching the gospel of God in Acts 13, verses 28 or so through 37, that was all about the gospel of God, and we'll get into that more in a few minutes, but Paul said he would be preaching this salvation as opposed to that salvation which they already had. Paul said, "To you is the word of this salvation sent." This salvation was sent to the Jews and to the God-fearing, Israel-blessing Greeks in the synagogue. There's no report of Paul's gospel of salvation having already been sent to all of the Gentiles. Remember that Greeks are a specific condition of Gentiles. All the Jews and the Greeks in the synagogue were believers that God delivered covenants of promise and commandments to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but their condition depended on their belief or disbelief of Jesus being Israel's resurrected Messiah. In Acts 14, verses 1 through 4, another look at some Greeks. In the synagogue there in Iconium, we can clearly see the distinction between Greeks and the rest of the Gentiles. They're distinguished between, they're divided. First, let's look at the verses and see what they say. For context, we'll read from Acts 13:50 and then verse 51, where we read about Paul's exit from the Antioch, from that territory in Pisidia. So starting with Acts 13:50, but the Jews stirred up the devout and honorable women and the chief men of the city and raised persecution against Paul and Barnabas and expelled them out of their coasts. Verse 51, but they shook off the dust off their feet against them and came unto Iconium, another city in the area. And Acts 14:1, it came to pass in Iconium that they went both together into the synagogue of the Jews. So we're seeing a pattern here. That's what they do when they get to a town. So please turn to, here's another aspect that's playing on this situation. Turn to John 9:22. These words spake his parents because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if any man did confess that he was Christ, talking about Jesus, that he was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. So they didn't believe in Jesus, and they didn't want anybody in that building that would believe in Jesus. The synagogue hosting Jews would not believe that Jesus was the Christ, and that's the one thing that they missed, that they required. They already believed the covenant. They believed and tried to keep the commandments and the offerings when they failed. They did the circumcision, the Sabbath, but they would not believe that the last thing they needed to, that Jesus was the Christ, the Messiah, risen from the dead. That's what the gospel of God is that Paul preached first. They did not believe the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. That was their condition. That was It was a condition of being disbelieving Jews, disbelievers. And it's a sad condition to be in. Well, let's go on. Verse 1 again. And it came to pass in Iconium that they went both together into the synagogue of the Jews, and so spake that a great multitude, both of the Jews and also of the Greeks, there are the Greeks, they believed. And here we see a second condition of Jews that not only believed the covenants, but also believed the gospel of God, unto which Paul was separated. It says Romans 1 verse 1. That was his status. When he was saved at first, he was separated unto the gospel of God during that time. And the condition of those Jews was that of being believing Jews, or little flock Jews. In one verse, when we read that, read it, besides the two conditions of Jews, we also see some Greeks mentioned in there. And the verse tells us the condition of those Greeks. The Greeks believed that Jesus was the Christ when Paul preached it to them. They hadn't heard it before. Paul was the dispenser of that good news, that Jesus fulfilled those Old Testament prophecies about who the Messiah would be. So, being Greeks who previously believed Israel's covenants, their condition now was that of being gospel of God believing Gentiles. Let's see, we'll look at the verse again. Verse 1, and it came to pass in Iconium that they went both together into the synagogue of the Jews, and so spake that a great multitude, both of the Jews and also of the Greeks, believed. Does that sound familiar? Does the Jews and also the Greeks sound familiar? Romans 1:16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth. That's a narrowing down, isn't it? You got to believe it for it to apply to you. And the other narrowing down comes in the next line, and to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. Well, the Greeks came to God the same way the Jews did, through Israel. So that's saying to everyone that believes in Israel, or as an Israelite. So those that addressed Paul, or that Paul addressed, we should say, after his sending in Acts 13 verses 2 and 4, they were the Jews and also the Greeks that Christ sent him to at that time. That's what the verse we just read, Romans 1:16 says. The saving gospel of Christ was sent to those people at that time. So let's look at Acts 13:26 in relation to Acts 14:1. Men and brethren, children of the stock of Abraham, and whosoever among you feareth God, to you is the word of this salvation sent. And it came to pass in Iconium that they went both together into the synagogue of the Jews, and so spake that a great multitude, both of the Jews and also of the Greeks, believed. Sounds like Paul is going into enemy territory there by going into the synagogue. But those are the two people groups to whom Christ sent Paul, as reported in Acts 26, verses 16 and 17. Christ sent Paul, making him a minister and a witness of his revelations to people from whom Christ would deliver Paul. Christ would deliver Paul from both the people and from the Gentiles unto whom he sent He sent him to these people that he would have to deliver him from. And there's a link here. I can give it to. I can post it later if you want. Anybody requests it about that very thing. Let's listen to that commission that happened soon after Paul was saved, and it's told about in Acts 26 verses 16 and 17. Here we go. But rise and stand upon thy feet, for I have appeared unto thee for this purpose, to make thee a minister and a witness, both of the things which thou hast seen, and of those things in the which I will appear unto thee. That's a pledge. I will appear unto thee, delivering thee from the people and the Gentiles unto whom now I send thee. Christ sent Paul to those from whom he would deliver him. By that time, the only Gentiles Paul had been sent to was those believing Gentiles, those Greeks, who were in a position in the synagogues to provoke Israel to jealousy. Those were the only ones, only Gentiles involved were the ones that, well, let's look at the verse, Romans 11:11. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? No, they shouldn't fall. It goes on, God forbid. But rather, through their fall, through Israel's fall, salvation is come unto the Gentiles. Is his present tense. By the time he wrote Romans in Acts 20, the Gentiles were coming to salvation. We're getting into salvation. Let me read this again here. But rather through their fall, salvation is come unto the Gentiles, for to provoke them, Israel, to jealousy. Their fall happened in Acts 7, and that's another story, but you can compare Acts 7, the last 10 verses in Acts 7 with Matthew 10:32, and see that they did cry out against the Holy Spirit. And that did fulfill the warning that Christ had said that it would be an unforgivable sin for Israel to do that. And they did it. Well, so far we've discovered two types of Jews, believing and disbelieving, regarding the Messiahship of Jesus. And we've discovered a type of Gentile, Greeks that believed Paul's gospel of God, that Jesus is the Messiah, risen from the dead. We're going to read a little further, starting where we were in Acts 14:1, and we'll go to 2 also. It came to pass in Iconium that they went both together into the synagogue of the Jews, and so spake that a great multitude, both of the Jews and also of the Greeks, believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and made their minds evil affected against the brethren. In Acts 14:2, who are the brethren? Who are the Gentiles? Who are the unbelieving Jews there? Well, look at the previous verse. They went both together into the synagogue of the Jews, and so spake that a great multitude, both of Jews and Greeks, believed. We've already seen that the unbelieving Jews run the synagogues, to which Paul went and read their scriptures. They stored the scriptures in the synagogues. But that identifies the unbelieving type of Jew, those apostate Jews running the synagogues. The brethren that great multitude, both of the Jews and of the Greeks, that believed, they were believers. They were not the unbelievers or disbelievers. But who were the Gentiles that the unbelieving Jews stirred up? That's the question. They stirred them up and made their minds evil affected. Those Gentiles were not the Gentiles that were called Greeks, which believed. Those Gentiles were other Gentiles from outside the synagogue. They were Gentiles that the Bible elsewhere calls alien. Not aliens from space, but aliens apart from Israel and God's program with Israel, God's program of saving people through Israel at that time, which ended at the fall of Israel in Acts 7, but the name existed. They were Gentiles because they were separated from God's people. Alien Gentiles because they were separated. Those Gentiles didn't care about God. They didn't care about Abraham or his God. They had to be stirred up before they got involved. So let's go on to verse 3 in Acts 14. Long time, therefore, abode they would be Paul and Barnabas there. Long time, therefore, abode they, speaking boldly in the Lord, which gave testimony unto the word of his grace, and granted signs and wonders to be done by their hands. Verse 4, but the multitude of the city was divided, part held with the Jews, and part with the apostles. The Jews would be those that stirred them up, those synagogue runners, people that run the synagogues. Actually, in verse 1, excuse me just a minute, please. In verse 1, there are two conditions of Jews. There is the synagogue of the Jews with the Jews that run the synagogue, and there also are the Jews that believe Paul's preaching along with the Greeks. So the two conditions of Jews were first was believing Jews in Acts 14:1, and the second condition is disbelieving Jews in Acts 14:4. And those running the synagogue in 14:1. As we've seen the two conditions of Jews, we also see two conditions of Gentiles in verses 1 and 2. First, those Gentiles that believed Paul's gospel of God, and then secondly, those stirred up Gentiles with the evil affected minds. Again, in verse 4, Acts 14:4, but the multitude of the city was divided, and part held with the Jews, that's those stir 'em up Jews, and part with the apostles, and the believers that believed the apostles, the apostles' preaching of the word. In Acts 14, verse 4, who was the part that was with the apostles, and who was the part that was with the Jews? You can see the context explains it, really. The only ones with the apostles were the Jews and Greeks that believed. The part that held with the Jews were all those towny Gentiles with the evil affected minds from the town. That was Iconium. And we can see right there that there were two conditions of Gentiles, the Greeks and the aliens. And now let's go on to verse 5 and 6. When there was an assault made, both of the Gentiles and of the Jews, also of the Jews, with their rulers, that's the ruling Jews there in the synagogues, to use them despitefully and to stone them, they were ware of it and fled. As we go over the passage, we see that in Acts 14, verse 1, both Paul and Barnabas went together into the synagogue of the Jews, and we're at at a breaking point here. We'll try to finish it tomorrow, okay? That'll be the last lesson in it and bring it to a conclusion. But after this song, we have an opportunity to hear about that controversy about when was the Lord Jesus Christ crucified. And was it Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, some other day? Some other day. Okay, let's hear the song. We'll go right into the lesson then after that.